Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're going to be taking a totally fascinating, highly analytical look at a deeply provocative essay by an author named Xu Feng. It's titled, Democracy is the Pursuit of Mediocrity. Now, you might be wondering why we're digging into something so controversial. Well, understanding how these extreme anti-democratic arguments are constructed actually helps us critically examine the very systems we rely on every single day. Just to be clear up front, we aren't here to take sides or endorse any viewpoints today. Instead, we're going to completely and objectively deconstruct this essay. We'll map out exactly how the author builds his case against collective decision-making, taking you all the way from his historical examples right up to his wild theories about the structure of the universe itself. It's an incredible study in argumentation, so let's get into it. Okay, let's dive into this. Right out of the gate, Xu Feng hits us with this absolute, bold rejection of collective wisdom. In Chinese culture, there's this really popular proverb that says, 3 humble cobblers, if they just put their heads together, can outsmart the legendary military strategist Zhuge Liang. Well, Xu Feng completely rejects that. He argues the exact opposite, saying no way, not even 30,000 cobblers could outwit a singular genius. His whole thesis is that when push comes to shove and critical decisions are on the line, one single person with a lofty vision is mathematically and practically going to crush the collective choice of tens of thousands of average, or as he bluntly calls them, mediocre minds. To really grasp the rest of his argument, we have to understand exactly how the author defines democracy. He definitely doesn't frame it as this great societal virtue or a beacon of freedom. Actually, he views it strictly as a mechanical flaw. According to the essay, democracy is just a system that inevitably drives you into a dead end. He defines it by 2 main things: incredibly low efficiency and endless mutual finger-pointing. He's basically saying that by trying to accommodate every single voice in the room, the system just naturally sinks straight down to the lowest common denominator, which to him is mediocrity. So here's our roadmap for deconstructing this. We're going to break it down into 5 key pillars. 1, lessons from Mao's history. 2, the universal rule of 1. 3, 8 types seeking democracy. 4, the Lifechanyuan alternative. And finally, 5, the dilemma of tyranny. All right, jumping right into part 1, lessons from Mao's history. To prove that this whole collective decision-making thing is actually really dangerous, the author points straight to early 20th century Chinese history. The essay fires off this rapid sequence of historical demotions for Mao. Watch this timeline. In June 1929, he's forced out of the Frontline Committee. By November 1931, the Collective Party mistakenly criticizes him, completely elbowing him out of the Central Committee. Over in October 1932, he loses his post as political commissar. And then finally, by January 1934, he is basically stripped down to a figurehead, totally removed as chairman of the Central People's Committee. What Xu Feng is doing here is framing every single one of these demotions not as standard, everyday political reshuffling, but as these disastrous, critical errors made by a collective that's stubbornly deciding against a singular visionary. And here's exactly how he connects those dots. It's like a domino effect for him. Step 1, the collective repeatedly demotes their visionary. Step 2, as a direct result of that democracy, the red bases start shrinking and the revolution hits a desperate low tide. Step 3, the central base gets destroyed, causing this massive existential threat and forcing the Red Army into the grueling 25,000 li long march. He uses this specific historical sequence to argue that when you push out a singular, capable leader just to favor collective party consensus, you are going to walk right into a catastrophe. Moving right along to part 2, the universal rule of 1. So having laid down his historical proof, the author makes this absolutely massive conceptual leap. He jumps from human politics all the way to the cosmos itself. He asks us to imagine this wild, absurd, but pretty illustrative hypothetical. What if the universe was run as a democracy? Just imagine if all the cats and dogs out there suddenly demanded that the throne of the greatest creator be shared in turns through democratic elections. His conclusion? The whole universe would literally collapse into chaos. He contrasts this disaster with what he calls the orderly 1. Whether you're talking about the creator running the universe, a state leader running a country, a boss running a business, or even just a conductor leading an orchestra, he argues that true order completely relies on unilateral, unquestioned command. And this brilliantly illustrates his next point. He brings in this famous quote from Napoleon to really anchor this cosmic theory. Nothing is more difficult, and therefore more precious, than to be able to decide. Xu Feng leans heavily on Napoleon here to hammer home the idea that effective leadership is all about making those hard, singular choices. To him, it's only when a chief commander puts their foot down and decides that action can finally be orderly and actually effective. Which brings us perfectly to the core philosophical doctrine driving this whole essay. The sage embraces the one and becomes the model of the world. The author firmly believes that anyone building a business, leading an organization, or guiding a state absolutely must retain total decision-making power. You have to embrace the one. If you try to dilute that power by sharing it with a committee or taking a vote, you aren't just making a bad management choice, you are violating the fundamental model of the world itself. All right, let's look at part 3, 8 types seeking democracy. Now, you might be asking, if democracy is so fundamentally broken, why in the world do so many people advocate for it? Well, the essay breaks it down into 8 specific types of people who want democracy, and he groups them to paint a very deliberate picture. First, you have the folks he sees as actively avoiding effort. The irresponsible people, those with mediocre minds, people without any definite views of their own, and the ones who just want to shift responsibility onto someone else. Then you have this second, more malicious group. These are the people using democracy as a cover. The selfish, the ones scrambling for power, people operating stealthily, and profiteers who basically just want to piggyback on everyone else's labor without sacrificing a single thing themselves. Because he genuinely believes that democratic systems are just filled with these 8 types of people, he draws this incredibly stark contrast in management styles. On the left side, you've got joint control. He argues that anytime 2 or more people are in control, it just instantly morphs into this resource-draining, super low-efficiency machine of mutual finger-pointing where absolutely nobody takes the blame. But on the right side, the solution? One responsible individual. They make decisions strictly within their scope, and there are absolutely 0 arguments, no debates, and no dragging things out for a consensus. Which brings us to part 4, the Lifechanyuan alternative. So if we strip away all the debates, all the arguments, and all the collective voting, what does society actually look like? The author proposes what he calls the Lifechanyuan era. It's a proposed system that totally rejects democracy. Instead, the whole thing runs on this principle of strict delegated duty. He uses this great cultural metaphor of the 8 immortals crossing the sea. Basically, each individual just shows their special prowess in their own specific lane. Every single task is handed to one entirely responsible person. And everyone else, your job isn't to chime in or offer your opinion. Your job is to cooperate fully and follow that person's requirements meticulously. So the crucial point is captured perfectly in this one vivid analogy. Picture a democratic flock of sheep on one side and a single focused wolf on the other. Shuofeng argues that no matter how fair or how wonderfully democratic that flock of sheep is, they are never, ever going to be able to resist that wolf. Translating that back to us humans, no matter how democratic a big group of people with mediocre wisdom is, they are never going to match the vision, the speed, and the sharp insight of a single saint or a visionary leader. Because of this, in his ideal system, finding consensus isn't a good thing. Actually, scratch that. It's seen as a total failure of leadership. Shuofeng writes that if a leader tries to handle affairs through compromises and consolidations, they are failing to assume their responsibility. Seeking consensus is quite literally viewed as a massive waste of everyone's time, their energy, and even natural resources. Finally, let's look at part 5, the dilemma of tyranny. Up to this point in the essay, the author's argument for unilateral control has been pretty much ironclad in his own mind. He starts wrapping things up by doubling down on his main thesis one last time. Democracy always leads to mediocrity, and the wise should guard against it. But then he admits to this one glaring, fatal vulnerability in his perfect universal rule of one. He drops this massive twist and leaves his readers with an unresolved question. He asks, if we do eliminate democracy and we rely completely on these singular, absolute leaders, what exactly should we do when a leader becomes self-willed, abuses their power, and exercises tyranny? And his answer to his own essay, it's literally just, I do not know. What do you think? It is such a fascinating, provocative way to end a highly rigid argument, admitting the ultimate danger of unilateral rule while still entirely rejecting democracy. And honestly, we are just going to leave you to ponder that exact same question. Thank you so much for joining us for this explainer.